So in the last video, I was talking about we were looking at how culture as a shared meaning can be a very helpful model to understand a given group, right? Especially if you're going to travel someplace, it's good to have an understanding of what are the cultural patterns, what are the cultural norms regarding symbol use and communication, right? But one of the things that culture as shared meaning tends to overlook is things like power, right, and history, and different, uh, things like inequities within a certain group. Who gets to decide what normal is in a culture? Who gets to decide what the norms are for communication, right? And culture as a side of contested meaning, or what we sometimes refer to as the cultural studies definition, is really taking into account this the way that these symbols are contested, right? It's actually a fight, in some ways, a symbolic fight, right, over meaning and who gets to say what something means. I used to do this example in this class where I would say, okay, what is an American class? And people would think of like, oh, it's hamburgers and hot dogs and NASCAR and football, and then other people say, well, no, American is diversity. America is Latinos, right? America is jambalaya, right? So who gets to say what an American is, right? And so it's an example of the ways that language and meaning is contested, right? And this approach also takes into things like race, class, gender, sexuality, nationality, right? So it takes into account the ways that our positions in the world might impact what meaning is, right? And how we feel about things, and what we know about a given subject, right? Might come from our sort of intersecting identities, right? It also looks at how culture is an apparatus of power, a system of domination. So a lot of culture, right, we didn't choose, right? It kind of chose us, and it was taught to us, and what was normal. And if you didn't fit in, right, there was costs, right? If you're, maybe you didn't move your body in the right way, and we got taught how we're supposed to hold ourselves, or taught what was quote unquote appropriate. And so this does build on culture as a site of shared meaning, but it looks at it in terms of power, right? Looks at it in terms of how things are negotiated, right? Take, for example, even, obviously Black Lives Matter, right? and Black Lives Matter is saying that Black people are disproportionately the victims, right, of police brutality. But for some reason, right, if you come from a different standpoint or a different background, you're like, oh, all lives matter, right? But it's not saying, right, that Black lives matter at the expense of all other lives, right? It's just saying that Black lives matter, and then we need to be reminded of that, or there wouldn't be this disproportionate amount of people of color being victims of the police, right? But yeah, for some people that's contested for them, right? Like they hear it differently, right? Depending on kind of where they are in relationship to these symbols, right? Also, something like immigration, right? If you ask what is an American, right, it would also be appropriate to say immigrants. Historically, right, we are a country of immigrants, right? But you also, it's very common for often people will say white, right? Picket fence, man and woman, husband and wife, 2.5 kids, right? I'm like, well, who gets to say? Who gets to say, right? And so that's an example of how culture is really a contested side of meaning. And of course, this guy, right, Colin Kaepernick. So I taught this class the last couple of years, and oftentimes there's a divide on what this kneeling has meant, right? And most recently with the killing of George Floyd, right, it's also changed and shifted as more and more people have found this acceptable, right? So, for some people, he's like, oh, he's protesting the flag. He's disrespecting the flag. And he's like, no, this is about police brutality, right? Was his position. And so, where the other side, quote unquote, is saying, oh, no, he's disrespecting our troops or the flag. But it's interesting, who recommended to Colin Kaepernick that he take a knee was a Green Beret. And he was looking for a way to honor the flag and at the same time take a stand against police brutality. And the Green Beret actually suggested to him, military guy, that this is the way to honor the flag and at the same time to stand up for police brutality. So yeah, but right, like, but President Trump, right, has critiqued this, right, and while now this protest has spread, of course, to the NBA, to a bunch of other sports, right, and even then, right, the meaning is kind of shifted, right, so teaching this PowerPoint in 2018 or 2016 is a lot when he first started to do it, when he first started to kneel, versus 2020, right? And how that meaning has become more acceptable. It feels more acceptable as it's spread into more sports. So, also a great example of how symbols and what this means are messy, complicated, and under in dispute, and we have to take into account power and history when we talk about these sorts of things. Also, this is key. When we look at the cultural studies definition, we get this term called hegemony. And your book kind of talks about it as domination by consent. It's kind of like the ways that we in some ways kind of get brainwashed into by our culture about what is normal, what is, the proper worldview, how should what's acceptable within a given society. It actually comes from like the American hegemony, like American hegemony or hegemony, how the U.S. is kind of the world superpower, right? And how the U.S. has dominated the rest of the world in terms of economy and culture and military might, right? And it's considered the global hegemon, right? And so you could also think of that in terms of cultural norms and expectations and ideas, right? And how they've been taught to us about, what is beautiful or, what is sexy, right? Like, think of like a high-heeled shoe, for example, right? How it's like a very, it's been considered like very sexual in our culture, and who gets to say what that is, right? And some people have argued that high heels are inherently oppressive to women because you have to crunch up your feet. It makes it hard to walk, right? And at the same time, it's this very eroticized image in our culture, right? And probably participates in like the objectification of women, right? Might be a critique of that. At the same time, right, some people might say, no, I actually feel more beautiful when I wear heels, and men can wear heels too, and I find heels to be very empowering, right? And so we have to take that into account. Like, it's too simple, really, to say like hegemony is just one group's power over another, telling you what is beautiful or cool, right? But that people have a degree of agency and can make choices, even though there might be this kind of like dominant culture or group out there, people still have agency to make their own choices, to re-signify, what high heels mean, right? They don't just mean, quote unquote, hegemonic, beautiful. To me, they mean something subversive, right? When Prince wears high heels, right? Or Woody would wear high heels, right? And so maybe Sorrells could be a little bit more kind of open with her discussion of hegemony. But in general, hegemony is the ways that the powerful kind of shape what's culturally acceptable, right? And even in terms of like our life scripts, right? What you're supposed to do and when is really kind of taught to us, and not even overtly taught to us, but just like through images and narratives and norms and those kinds of things. What is a successful life, right? Is often taught to us by our cultural and the powerful in our culture. So now I'd like to stop here and I'll get into culture as a resource. But this culture as a contested side of meaning is also a good a great definition of culture. And I would say that no definition of culture is quote unquote better than any other necessarily. They just account for different things, right? So culture as a set of contested meaning, wouldn't necessarily be that helpful if you were looking for the norms of, traveling abroad in a different country, right? What do yellow flowers mean in Ukraine, right? When you bring someone yellow flowers, right? Yeah, because it's looking at how it's more a contested negotiated meaning, whereas culture as a shared meaning would be a helpful framework because you'd be like, oh, it usually means this, right? It usually means friendship or something like that, right? Whereas this definition gets pretty messy fast, and that's also why it's great, right? Because it takes into account the ways that definitions are, in fact, our use of symbols are, in fact, messy.